I'm talking to Roger Helmer, who's a Eurosceptic member of the European Parliament. He's vehemently opposed to further integration with the European Union and also supports renegotiating many of the UK's treaties with the EU. Roger Helmer, thank you very much for talking to RT. First of all, how would you characterise the UK's relationship with the EU?
There's a big question. We have always been reluctant members of the European Union. When we joined it, we were told that it was merely a trading operation. We had a referendum. I voted in favour. If I'd known then what I know now, I would have voted against. But we have this unfortunate feeling that on the one hand we don't like it very much, we resent all the nonsense. On the other hand, many people think, well, Europe's a long way away, it doesn't affect me very much, so let them get on with it. In fact, of course, it does intimately affect the lives of all of us, and huge swathes of policy areas are decided in Brussels, not decided in the UK. In my view, it is making us poorer and less democratic and less free, and I believe we would be better off out.
Do you support, at this stage, a referendum on being in the EU, if it were possible?
Well, I think we should start with the referendum that every major political party in Britain promised us, which is the referendum on the Lisbon Treaty. What they're now saying is, well, it's been ratified, it's too late. No, it isn't too late. We should have a referendum saying, do you accept the terms of the Lisbon Treaty, or do you wish the government to renegotiate those terms? And that would give, I'm sure we get a renegotiation answer, that would give a British government a very strong position, a very strong mandate to renegotiate. So that's what we ought to do. Now, the question that is also arising, should we have a referendum on in or out? I'm less clear there what the outcome would be. I think probably after a good campaign we would actually get an out vote, but I'm less confident of it. And of course, if we had an in or out vote and the people voted to stay in, then I suppose the issue would be off the agenda for 20 years. So from my point of view, that is a high-risk route. I would just like to see the referendum that we originally were promised.
It always interests me to meet members of the European Parliament who are opposed to the EU as a construct. How does that work?
Well, I'm often asked that question, and there's a sort of underlying assumption that if you take the Brussels shilling, then you're there to support them. And sadly, that applies to too many people. It applies to the great majority of MEPs and virtually all the staff, virtually all the commissioners, and so on. I take the view that I'm not elected to support the European Union and to promote it. I'm elected to represent the interests of the people who voted for me. And I recall that in the last election in 2009, a majority of voters in my region, and nationally I think, supported broadly Eurosceptic parties, or at least they believed that the Conservative Party was Eurosceptic, which brings us to the issue that in terms of the coalition government, it's really failing to deliver on that expectation.
Prime Minister David Cameron's position as a Eurosceptic didn't seem to be in any doubt before he came to power, but now it doesn't seem to be so clear.
I think it's tragic. Something that my colleague Dan Hannan points out is that the higher people climb up the greasy pole, the more sympathetic they become to large centres of power like the European Union. You take William Hague, he had a reputation as a clear, principled Eurosceptic. I had great confidence in him. It seems to me now that he's shifted his position, he's trimmed so that he's sort of prepared to accommodate. He's prepared to come up with a few Eurosceptic quotes from time to time, but actually we've accepted EU regulation of the City of London, we've accepted the EU diplomatic service, we've accepted the EU investigation order. We are passing powers to Brussels arguably more quickly than the previous Labour government did, and I personally am deeply unhappy with that.
And William Hague, in fact, expressly opted into the European investigation order, didn't he?
I believe it was Theresa May who actually signed it off, but it was an unforced error. We didn't have to. We could simply have said no. We could have introduced, as with the European arrest warrant, we could have introduced national protections and safeguards in the way that some other member states have. We just seem to roll over and play dead. Something like 1,300, I think, British citizens were sent abroad under the European arrest warrant last year. That's more than half of all the cases in the whole of the European Union. I've followed the case of a couple of my constituents who have been appallingly badly treated, absolutely wicked. The freedoms that we used to believe were inherent to English men and women have just been taken away from us.
But surely a thing like the European investigation order and arrest warrant is something which enables Europe-wide investigations to take place against criminals and potentially against terrorists. That's got to be a good thing, hasn't it?
It's intended to do that, but what it does is it sets aside all of the safeguards and checks and balances that we normally associate with the extradition of criminals. Of course we must have arrangements to extradite criminals and terrorists, and we had those. And they do take time because the safeguards take time, but it's right that they should. It is not right that innocent citizens should be sent abroad, held in jail, as in the case of my constituents, for nearly 3 months, tried, acquitted, then recalled because the prosecutor is appealing against the acquittal, and now recalled for a third time. One of them has been acquitted twice and is told he must go back again for a formal judicial process to confirm the acquittal. For heaven's sake, this man has had 2 years of his life ruined, despite the fact that 2 courts in Riga, because it's in Riga, 2 courts in Riga have separately found him not guilty. This is just unjustifiable treatment of British citizens.
Let's talk about what's happening in Europe at the moment. Recently, we've seen a rise in protests against austerity measures. What do you see there going forward?
Well, I could see a long period of quite serious protests and unrest. But the political and broader economic questions are really very interesting. We're seeing that the German people are becoming extremely reluctant to be the bankers of last resort for the Eurozone. Germans who retire at 65 don't want to keep paying money to Greece where they retire at 58 in order to maintain a Mediterranean lifestyle. So there's deep unhappiness there. I think it comes down to the issue of the euro currency. We Eurosceptics have always said that the euro currency couldn't work because you have disparate economies with different economic cycles. They can't all have the same monetary policy, and therefore they can't all have the same currency. And frankly, for best part of 10 years, the euro seemed to work sort of all right. And people would say, well, you predicted all these disasters, nothing's gone wrong. Well, no, it has, and this is exactly what we expected. You simply cannot have Germany, on the one hand, which has been extremely careful with inflation and wage rates and all those things, in the same monetary union as places like Greece and Italy and Spain, which have been entirely profligate and have allowed their unit labour costs to run out of control, cease to be competitive. Those countries ought to devalue, or Germany ought to revalue. Within a currency union, they can't. So either some of the peripheral Club Med countries are going to have to peel off at the bottom, or Germany is going to have to get out at the top. You could have a currency union, probably of Germany, the Benelux, France, Austria, but the moment you put in all these other countries, it just isn't going to work.
What's the solution then? Recently, a European central banker said that countries opting out of the Eurozone would be committing economic and political suicide.
Well, it wouldn't be tantamount to suicide, but they face a very hard choice, because staying in, they're going to have the most desperate problems. Getting out, I'd be the first to admit, they're going to have desperate problems. It's a choice between 2 evils, and it's difficult for me to say which is the greater evil. But they, in a sense, they may not have a choice, because the bond markets may decide for them. I personally think that a country like Greece would go through a period of desperate pain if they left. They would certainly have to default, or reschedule it's called. That's much politer than default. But they have to do something like that. Basically, people who lent money to Greece would have to take a haircut, and probably quite a substantial haircut. But that's roughly what happened to Argentina, whenever it was, 1990. And it's terrible at the time. But the country comes through, and actually it's much better off afterwards. It's just like when Britain left the exchange rate mechanism. You know, it was called Black Wednesday. Suddenly, in retrospect, we realised that it was Golden Wednesday, because we had a long period of sustained economic growth because we got our currency back to the right level. That's what Greece needs, that's what Spain needs, that's what Ireland needs. But they are so committed politically, emotionally, psychologically to the euro project that they dare not bring themselves to make that leap. They may be forced to make it by the markets, and when they do, that, I think, will be the point at which the European Union starts to unravel, because they've invested so much sort of like the Lord of the Rings, you know, all the power is in the ring, and when the ring's dissolved, it's gone. All the economic and political motivation of the European project comes to a central point in the single currency. When the single currency starts to break up, it will cause big questions to be asked about the viability of the Union.
So you see this affecting the economic and political union as a whole?
Yes. I don't think the European Union can last forever. I like to compare it to the USSR. We shouldn't take that comparison too far, but there are a lot of factors. Essentially, both the USSR and the European Union have decided to create structures that ignore the identity and aspiration of the people, and eventually the aspiration and identity of the people reasserts itself. The Soviet Union lasted, what was it, about 70 years. The European Union has just lasted about 50 years. And I wouldn't be at all surprised to see the same pattern. I think in 20 years' time there may be something that's called the European Union, but I think it'll look very different and be much less influential than it is today.
And yet becoming a member of the Eurozone is still something that countries aspire to. Estonia will become a member in January.
Yes, I think Estonia is very unwise to do that. I could see a case for a Baltic currency union. I mean, they're what, 1.5 million people, and that's a very small country. To have its own independent currency. Although quite small countries like Singapore and Switzerland have independent currencies and really do rather well with them. But there will be a case for a Baltic Union. There is not a case for Estonia, in my view, being in the same currency union with Germany, Ireland and Greece.
Roger Helmer, thank you very much.
My pleasure.